All right, welcome back to video number 3. In this video, we're going to again jump around. We're going to talk about schizophrenia. We're going to talk about personality disorders, dissociative disorders, and then finally end by talking about eating disorders. And that will conclude this chapter. And then we'll move on to videos for the therapy chapter. Okay. So first, I want to show you this graphic. Again, this graphic will be good to know for the quiz. Here we see heritability rates for different disorders, some of which we already talked about, others of which we will talk about. Bipolar disorder, though, is the most heritable disorder that we see. So again, a strong genetic basis for bipolar disorder, closely followed by schizophrenia, then anorexia nervosa, major depressive disorder, and then finally generalized anxiety disorder. Okay. So let's talk about schizophrenia here next. These pieces of art, by the way, they were painted by a man by the name of Louis Wayne, and he has schizophrenia, and you can kind of see the progression of his disease from left to right. And so he was known for making cat paintings, and you can see how his art had changed along with the progression of his disease. So schizophrenia translated literally means split mind, so like a fractionated mind. And it's not like dissociative disorders, which we'll talk about here in a little bit in that sense, but rather what we mean by split mind is that the person is basically divorced from reality, okay? So in terms of ways of thinking, perceptions, right, their reality is completely altered, okay? So schizophrenia, a psychotic disorder characterized by delusions, which we'll define here in a little bit, hallucinations, which we will also define, disorganized speech, and blunted or inappropriate emotional expressions. So symptoms can fall into kind of one of two categories. The first of which is what are known as positive symptoms, in which there is a presence of an inappropriate behavior. So in other words, typical people don't show this behavior, but a person with schizophrenia does show this abnormal behavior or this atypical behavior. Negative symptoms, on the other hand, what we see is that there is an absence of some sort of appropriate behavior. So in, again, neurotypical individuals, you'll see this behavior that is present, but it's not present in the case of the schizophrenic patient. So here we have both type 1 and type 2 schizophrenia broken down. Again, positive symptoms here on the left, negative on the right. So characteristic symptoms include, in the case of positive, delusions and hallucinations. Again, neurotypical people don't experience these things. Those with schizophrenia may. Response to anti-dopaminergic drugs. We'll talk about this here in a minute, but dopamine, there is an overabundance in the schizophrenic brain. So a lot of drugs try to reduce the levels of dopamine in the brain. Some symptoms can be treated through this anti-dopaminergic drug. They tend to be positive, but in the case of negative, kind of a poorer outcome. Symptom outcome, potentially reversible in the case of positive. It may be irreversible in the case of negative. By the way, I should have mentioned some negative symptoms include poverty of speech, so not being able to produce fluent speech, lack of affect, so kind of like emotional bluntedness, just very emotionally flat. Intellectual impairment we see is absent in the case of positive, sometimes present in the case of negative, and then finally, the suggested pathological process. So there might be some kind of differences in terms of the neurobiology going on. So in this case here, we see that there's an overabundance of D2 dopamine receptors. That's just a particular dopamine pathway, D2. And then cellular loss in the temporal lobes. That's more characteristic of negative symptoms. So with negative symptoms, we kind of understand that as being bad, like more bad, okay? So schizophrenia, let's again explore these different symptoms. Disturbed perceptions, specifically hallucinations. These describe seeing, feeling, tasting, smelling things that only exist in the mind. So again, sensory experience without the presence of any stimulus. Okay. So all just kind of internally generated. Okay. So this is characteristic of schizophrenia. Secondly, disorganized thinking and speech. That's kind of like a second class of symptoms. So delusions refer to false beliefs. Common ones include that that person is Jesus or Muhammad or some sort of prophet. With this, the person also may have paranoid tendencies. And so they may think that the FBI is after them, or that they have been probed by aliens or things like that, right? And so again, these are false beliefs. They have no basis in reality, but nevertheless, they feel very real to this person with schizophrenia. Right? Also, what's characteristic of schizophrenia sometimes is something known as a word salad, in which the person cannot produce fluent speech at all. It's just senseless speech. They may be able to make grammatical sentences, but they have no meaning whatsoever. And then finally, we see that there are attentive problems as well that are characteristic. And so poor selective attention. We talked about attention a few weeks ago, right? Okay. And then finally, diminished or inappropriate emotions. So again, flat affect, so very unemotionally responsive. Sometimes, again, inappropriate emotions. So for instance, if the person were told your parent died, they might start laughing or something like that, right? Not appropriate for the situation. And then we also see impaired theory of mind. As a reminder, theory of mind refers to your ability to perspective take, understand that other people's perceptions and experiences differ from your own. And we see that schizophrenia, there's impaired theory of mind. We talked about impaired theory of mind in relation to autism as well, several chapters ago. Okay. So in terms of heritability, we already discussed this, but schizophrenia is a highly heritable disorder. We understand that there's not just a single schizophrenia gene, but there are many genes that are implicated in schizophrenia. What's interesting is that there have also been environmental factors that have been identified, again, as risk factors for going to get schizophrenia. These include, this is not exhaustive by any means, but low birth weight, older paternal age, lack of oxygen during delivery, maternal prenatal nutrition, and then finally, mid-pregnancy viral infection. So during the second trimester, if the mother goes on to get like the flu or something like that, that is an increased risk factor for schizophrenia. Okay. In terms of the prevalence rates, schizophrenia, 1 in 100 are diagnosed. If you have a family member who has been diagnosed with schizophrenia, the rate jumps to 1 in 10. Again, we talked about dopamine in relation to schizophrenia. There's also differences in terms of like myelination of a schizophrenia brain. There tends to be less myelin. So again, there are some structural and functional abnormalities here as well. So next, let's talk about dissociative disorders. A lot of people are fascinated by dissociative disorders. These are controversial, rare disorders in which conscious awareness becomes separated or dissociated from previous memories, thoughts, or feelings. A type of dissociative disorder that we're going to talk about is dissociative identity disorder, known as DID. This was formerly known as multiple personality disorder. Okay, that was this old DSM classification, but now it's known as DID. And this is, again, a rare disorder in which a person exhibits two or more distinct, what are known as alters, or differing personalities. Okay. So for instance, for your discussion board this week, you're supposed to watch a movie. There's one movie, I think it's Cybele, I think is, I've never seen it before, but I think that's a movie about multiple personality, or excuse me, dissociative identity disorder. Okay. So I have hidden here a slide that actually shows a video of a man. He doesn't have dissociative identity disorder, but he does experience a dissociation. And he ends up basically murdering his in-laws, and he does so while he is asleep. But again, he's dissociated from reality, and his name was, I think, Robert Parks, and this happened in Canada in 1992. And he actually ended up being, a judge ruled not guilty in that he was not in the right state of mind. He did not intentionally mean to kill his in-laws, but ultimately that's what happened. And so what ended up happening, according to the attorney, was that Parks drove to his in-laws' house while he was asleep, murdered them, awoke and saw what he did, and then he ended up turning himself in. Is basically how the story goes. But going back to dissociative identity disorder, we understand, again, it's very rare. We understand that the prevalence rate has increased almost exponentially over recent years. It's much more common in North America. The number of alters has been increasing in recent years as well. So while before people might say that they have one alternate personality, now it's more common for people to say they have two or three, or excuse me, 3 or 4 or 5, so on and so forth. And so again, there's a lot of clinicians who actually question the validity of DID, but nevertheless, it's still a DSM disorder. Next, personality disorders. These describe just disorders of just that personality. Refer to inflexible or enduring patterns of behavior that impair social functioning, and they can be organized into kind of like 3 separate groups. So cluster A, we have what are known as paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal, which are kind of more related to like schizophrenia in terms of personality. Cluster B, antisocial, which is related to like psychopathy. So whenever you think of like Ted Bundy, that's antisocial. 25% of the prison population is estimated to have antisocial personality disorder. Borderline, histrionic, and then narcissistic. Again, these are kind of more emotionally volatile, I guess you would say, for cluster B. And then cluster C, avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive. These 3 disorders are related as well. So in total, we have 10 personality disorders. I'm not going to spend much time here on this, though. I'm not going to quiz you on it. But yeah, I will, though, dive into antisocial personality because that's one that people tend to enjoy. APD. So characterized by superficial charm, dishonesty, manipulativeness, self-centeredness, and risk-taking. We understand that APD has a strong genetic basis, that most diagnosed individuals are male. These individuals tend to care about only themselves. They can be very violent. They lack empathy. They can lack empathy, difficulty in theory of mind, so on and so forth. So finally, we're going to dive into different eating disorders. We're going to start with anorexia nervosa, jump to bulimia, and then end with binge eating disorder. Okay, and then we'll be done for this chapter. So eating disorders, anorexia nervosa is to where a person maintains a starvation diet despite being underweight. It's characterized by excessive dieting and exercise due to a distorted self-image. And so again, the perception, the cognitions are kind of a key characteristic of this disorder. We understand that's more common in some cultures as opposed to other cultures. There are a variety of influences, including heredity, cultural pressures, so such as societal norms. For instance, anorexia is much more common in women as opposed to men. Again, this goes back to expectations. Other influences include low self-esteem, negative emotions, stressful life experiences. This can be a very, very bad disorder. It oftentimes, if left untreated, it leads to premature death, almost a guarantee. There have been some prevention programs that have had some success, especially effective when it's interactive and focuses on girls over the age of 15. There's been quite a bit of success there. Bulimia nervosa. The person alternates between binging and purging. So binging referring to eating a lot of food. So there's not that starvation component there. But with bulimia, the person then purges it all back up. So oftentimes through vomiting. Okay. So sometimes followed by excessive fasting or excessive exercise. So bulimia also very bad. Throwing up that often is very bad for the esophagus, for the teeth. And so we also see that bulimia tends to be more common in females, but nevertheless, another eating disorder that can be very debilitating. And then finally, binge eating disorder. Here's our last slide. So binge eating disorder, this is characterized by significant binge eating, followed by distress, disgust, or guilt, but without the compensatory purging or fasting. And so binge eating disorder is the only disorder that's actually related to higher weight, and it's related to like obesity and things like that. In terms of American rates, we see about 1 in every 200 individuals suffer from anorexia, 1 in every 100 bulimia, and then binge eating, that's much more common. About 3% of Americans, so 3 out of 100, can be diagnosed with that disorder. So I know we kind of went through that really quickly, but again, I want to be kind of expeditious because there's a lot of, again, content to cover in these last 2 chapters. So that does it for this chapter. Let's jump into therapy here in this next video. Okay. All right. Take care.